really didn't think much of it. I didn't think it would take me anywhere, but when I unwrapped it and wanted to use the canvas for a different project, I paused and looked at it, and I liked the way that it moved in the air, and I liked the space that it was interacting with. The transparent material pulled me into a direction, and I wanted to pursue and explore this non-traditional painting surface. I started this quick study this summer, and during those months, I wrote down ideas and words that I thought could inspire me moving towards the beginning of my current studio practice. Some of my favorite words in the English language are the ones that contradict themselves. The word vanity appears to contradict itself, but I believe both of the definitions feed into one another. My outer appearance and the way I allow others to view me and perceive me stem from part A of the definition. I've been told that I am vain and place way too much value in my own appearance. But the reason that I invest so much in my physical being stems from part B of the definition, meaning that I feel like I am essentially worthless and that I lack substance. My value as a human stems from part A of the definition and the image and the idea of me. Essentially, definition A exists because of definition B and cannot exist without it, where B is greater than A. We place so much weight into the Western ideals of beauty and tend to think traditionally when describing things that we find aesthetically pleasing. This narrative was something that I wanted to hint on in my paintings, and I wanted to merge the history of the theatrical and allegorical Baroque style of painting with a new modern and contemporary methods of paint application. The nature of this non-traditional material allowed me to be transparent with my everyday feelings and thoughts. I wanted my figures to be theatrical in a very Western beauty standard type of way. The idea of being placed on this pedestal isn't new, but I wanted to comment on this old narrative through a newer lens. A non-traditional allegorical painting calls for a non-traditional studio practice. I got to work making crayon sketches of my figures, and I would cut them out and place them at the base of this pedestal. This allowed me to separate my figures and focus on them one layer at a time and think about how I wanted to present them in a more 3D atmosphere. They allowed me to essentially deconstruct my paintings. And these small crayon sketches eventually became larger drawings that I placed onto the panels shown later on in this presentation. I was incredibly blessed this year and had the largest amount of studio space out of all my peers. And the layout of my studio space changed and shifted as I continued creating. As I continued my urban sprawl across the 2D student studio floor, my making process came to a bit of a halt. I wanted my figures to look androgynous, and I really didn't want them to look anything like me. I wanted to detach myself from my work and talk about me without actually talking about me. I feared the overly sarcastic, "oh, it must be so hard" statements, and I became afraid to portray my own body and the story I was creating, inspired by a word that so heavily resonated with me. I was struggling to connect with my painting on a topic that I felt so strongly about. I drew and redrew this stagnant, cold, lifeless figure on top of a pedestal, painted and repainted her, trying to push through this wall and trying to understand where the wall came from. I was standing on top of tables to reach my work. I was investing in the making process physically, but I was avoiding the emotion I was wanting to portray. I didn't find beauty in my own paintings, and the figures started to lack substance for me. I was tunnel focused on part A of my umbrella topic, and in doing so, I was producing part B work. And once again, B became greater than A. The layout of how I still wanted to portray my painting still made sense to me. The space I wanted to consume was still important. And although I wasn't willing to be transparent with myself, the clear material was still fascinating with me, and I loved how the figures could dance around the main figure and move back and forth with the viewer's movements. Francis Bacon was an artist that was suggested to me, and although I didn't have a connection with his subjects or the way that he painted them, the way that he viewed paint and the making process resonated with me. In an interview, he stated, quote, "When you are painting, you are not only painting that object, you are painting yourself through your brushstrokes." And that was a phrase that tied A and B together for me. I then understood how to intertwine these two definitions and create one unified allegory or story. How dare I talk about the importance of my material if I wasn't willing to be clear and describe and define my work? When I allowed myself to feel what each character was feeling and going through, my passion for my painting reignited. And I know that I've been within every position and every character within my painting. This is why I chose to cast myself as each character in my story. I could still admire the theatrical pose I was placing my figures in, and I thought deeper about why each character was there and what I thought they were feeling when they were in these poses. Why couldn't they just be on her canvas, though? Why were they significant in themselves? And if I was going to paint myself 6 different times, what would I wear? Easy. I would wear what I thought my audience would want me to wear. I allow my backgrounds to clothe the figure, and what they are wearing is a reflection on the viewer's angle and height. Each figure constantly shifts and changes to match their surroundings and bend to the background. Each character performs for the viewers and dances through the air. This is the background of my body of work. So it was valid that the main characters were on a different plane than this one. The figures are still relevant in the bigger picture, but they did not have to exist on her canvas to influence her. They apply pressure that can be sensed in her stance, her facial expression, and her appearance. They cause damage to her and her column without laying a single hand on her. They can interact with each other and the work to produce one image, but they themselves can operate and affect the main subject separately. Layer 1, the gawkers. They are blissfully unaware of the actions in the other layers, and they don't notice the raising, spelled with a Z, in the second or third panel, or the raising in the third panel, spelled with an S. Trying so hard to morph their bodies to match their self-seeking eyes, what their self-seeking eyes search for in her. They hungrily contort their bodies to match. They sit and admire her at face value, and they study the outline of the main figure, trying to create a different reality for themselves. They crave the same attention and validation given to the main figure. They might be happy for the main figure during her triumphs, but they'll be the first to leave during her tribulations. They're not here to understand her. Her problems are irrelevant to them. They are here to admire. Layer 2, the stonecarver. So a stoneworker is graceful. They work really hard to raise the pedestal, and they have to be precise, premeditated, and tedious. They have all the power to chip away at the stone any way they please. The power they hold is like no other, and they scrape out dainty lacework in the unforgiving surface of the stone. Their ability to take whole facades down with one phrase, not enough, The gravity of the words "not enough" are often whispered and said in cool and calming conversations, but those 9 letters will always ring in your ears as if they were shouted. The phrase "not enough" chips away at our exteriors, no matter how long ago that lie was whispered. The statement alone can carve us down to nothing. Layer 3, the builder. Romans often use old pedestals to build new ones, and that was a part of the history that I thought was really interesting, and so I want to bring that into my painting. We are so quick and ready to move on to the next best thing, and we tear others down quickly, and we don't really pay attention to the path that we've created behind us. She gestures at the pedestal to her left, as if she's asking the viewer to do her dirty work and make the standards for the main figure taller and harder to reach. Her snarky facial expression states, "I will not be outdone." She tends to provide others and herself with the materials needed to build up the main figure. And although she is in a power stance, I hope you can see through that and find the false confidence. Cool. So each layer is a different chapter to the story I've painted. And I know that I've said I've been found throughout the entirety of my work, and there are moments when I am my biggest supporter and work really hard to build myself up, and then there are moments when I can condemn myself like no other. I don't think anybody has told me that I am not enough more than I have, and I know that I've been placed at the top of the pedestal by not only others, but by myself. At the end of the day, I am still pretty happy to be me. And I would like to take a moment to talk about the artist that influenced me as I was painting this project. One of my influences has always been Agnes Grakashka. I love the way that he can manipulate the human body and contort them, and I love how awkward his poses look. In my first panel, you can see the drawings and the outlines of my figures, and in his paintings, you can often find the scar marks of where he drew these figures. And so the way that he applies thin washes of paint has always really inspired me. Chazan is a person who is influenced by Agnes Grakashka. I also adore his awkward poses, and I adore his color palette. His flesh tones to me are always so warm and vibrant. I love the way that his poses defy gravity, and they seem to dance through the air. And that's how I felt like my figures were dancing through the air when they're on their panels. Agnes Grakashka is a Russian artist, and I love the sense of hollowness in the human body that she applies with her shapes. She creates these voids through her brush strokes that aren't exaggerated, but it allows us to fill in those blanks with our own knowledge. We know that those are hands, but the subtlety of the detail was important to me. And last but not least, Ray Turner. I love the fact that he allows paint to be paint, and he doesn't go over his paintings with a fine fan brush to smooth them over. He allows his strokes to be bold and colorful. He doesn't blend his colors, and I adore that. He tends to paint on top of glass panes, which I also found was interesting because I was painting on top of clear acrylic panels. And I love the bold suggestions that he makes in his faces. I would like to take a moment, though, and thank Chloe Carson for taking my pictures, and my classmates who stopped in to visit me and check on me and my progress throughout the year and throughout the night. I'd like to thank my mama Julie for coining the term 2.5D, which is exactly how I describe this work. I'd like to thank my professor, Brian Core, for being such a great and strong backbone to this unruly, scattered bunch. And last but never least, Christian Hessler and Avery Month. Thank you for holding me together. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
I'm going to start us off again.
Cool.
You talked about how all of your figures are you.
Yes.
All of them, though, are slightly morphed and look slightly different from you. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like and the process of what goes on inside of your head when portraying your own body inside of your work?
Yes, so like, unfortunately, I have to see myself every day. But I tend to shift my own appearance every day through like the way that I dress, the way that I do my hair, and the way that I apply makeup. So my face changes to me several times throughout a month. So I think having one really consistent face wasn't accurate because I don't look the same every day. So I wanted the variety of me to be there. So did that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Anyone else? Two questions.
You can go first.
Silent.
So when you were painting the different figures, you have different relationships with the figure on the pedestal.
Yes.
Did you find yourself relating, can you talk about how you related to the different relationships they had as you were painting figures?
Yeah, so in the first panel, I originally had 4 characters, and I eventually ended up with just 3. And I really had to, I sat there and I looked at all my figures, and I had to think about their core emotions. And so for me, those core emotions is what was the deciding factor of who went where and where they went as far as like left and right on the pedestal. The main feeling that I had when I painted the first panel was hunger. So that was hunger in more ways than one. So did that answer that?
Yeah.
So kind of tying back to the first question, obviously you've been working on this for a long, long time. And did you ever find that there was a time of day? Obviously you said you worked at night.
Yes.
Did you sense that, obviously you were painting yourself, did you sense that you felt better about yourself at night and that's why you liked painting at night? Or is it just that's how your schedule works?
In ways, yes. Like in ways at night, like I knew no one would be at the JDAC, and so like I could almost hide, if that makes sense. And like when I paint, I'm like in overalls, messy bun. I have paint all over my arms, so I can look as messy as I want to without somebody coming in and seeing me and seeing green or orange paint on my face. Anyone else?
Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you.
I would like to thank everybody for coming out tonight. So hi, my name is Mel Palmer, and my project is wrong way.
That's okay.
How do I go back?
The arrows.
Got it, thank you.
Yes. So that was a great discovery.
Great start. But my project is a multi-sensory installation titled How to Light Up a Room. It features projected photographic films, olfactory compositions, found soundtracks, and graphic structures. When this thesis project began, I didn't know that I wanted to do installation art, but the one thing that I really deeply did know is that I really wanted to dive into kinetic light painting. So kinetic light painting is a camera technique which utilizes this really long shutter speed and a lot of applied motion to the camera. So when motion is applied to the camera while it's taking the image, it kind of creates these really interesting light trails. And they look like a product of photo editing, but one thing that I really deeply love about it is that it's totally done during this process of taking an image. You can see this perfectly normal scene, and then when you look on your camera, it's kind of this distorted wonderland. And I am really, really fascinated by that. I really struggled with this project because I knew exactly the processes and the techniques that I wanted to use, but I kind of struggled with finding out what they conceptually meant to me and why they really had this deep meaning to me. During the process of creating this installation, I did a directed study with Turner McGee, and I found that a lot of the history of photography really cleared up why it really matters to me. So during this directed study, I learned about how people responded to the very first photographs. Many people saw photographs as this irrevocable truth. In this world where you had only seen things made by the human hand, these creations from a machine seemed like they could not fail. This is of course false. People have been editing photos forever, whether it was with paints or chemicals, camera motion, or softwares. Although nowadays most people would say that they are skeptical of any of the media they consume, we still often form ideas about ourselves and places that we've never even gone, and life itself from images. As a light painter, I think this practice is really important to me because it makes me question my personal assumptions and relationships about the images that I consume, and I hope that it does that for other people. My light painting journey began in an introduction to photography class. This is when I learned about the technique of camera tossing. Definitely not in class. I think the professor probably would have screamed if I told him what I was doing with the camera. But we had a lighting paint assignment actually, and I remember being really crunched for time that week. It seemed really complicated. The class was a night class. It was at 7 p.m. I was taking chemistry. I was kind of brain dead. He was going on about physics and lenses and light. And I just remember being like, I don't have time to learn that. So I Googled easiest way to light paint that looks good. And that's when I found a technique called camera tossing. Camera tossing, exactly what it sounds like. You just throw a camera up into the air. And it kind of creates stuff like this. I got really lucky. This was one of my first camera tosses. And I just remember feeling this really big sense of amazement afterwards. I use a rig so the camera doesn't truly fly anywhere, but some people don't. Some people really do throw their cameras 20 or 30 feet up into the air without anything protecting it, and that's part of their process. I really think what kind of light painter you are just really depends on whether you have faith or fear in God. Although this photo is beautiful, it's definitely a part of a highlight reel. It turns out that this really easy technique wasn't actually that easy. Sure, you maybe don't need a whole lot of skill, but you need a lot of unwavering persistence, because most camera tosses don't end up like this. They end up more like this. These are okay, but they're kind of random lines without much purpose or any interest in my personal opinion. So when I kind of felt limited with that process, I started to look into camera rotation. Camera rotations are a light painting technique where the camera spins in some way while the photo is being taken. This isn't a new technique, but this is the first camera rotation picture, which was taken in 1953 by photographer David Potts. However, it hasn't been explored in contemporary photography much. It's often treated as a camera trick to do once or twice instead of something to build a practice from. So I had a lot to learn when I wanted to explore it. After I had scrounged together the little research about this technique, I did two things. First, I bought a rotating table, and then I did what every art student is known to do when solving any type of problem. I developed an equation. It's very simple. Shutter speed is the camera setting divided by a number of placements where my camera moves, and then that kind of gives me the amount of seconds for this nice even exposure. So when light painting image is really evenly exposed, you can't really pick out the individual scenes. It kind of just creates this illusion that all these different layers are one. This process can be kind of hard to explain, so I've attached a time lapse. Typically this process is quite long, to 30 seconds to a few minutes, so that's why I picked a time lapse. As you can see, it's a pretty simple process. I set my camera on this rotating table, and then I put tape around the table in these pretty exact marks. When I first started doing this, I used a protractor and was very exact with everything, and now that I've done it so much, I find myself kind of relying more on intuition when I place those marks. When I started this, I really liked the idea of like taking this chaotic thing and making it as geometric and symmetrical as it can be. And now I kind of think some of the beauty in these images is that they are never going to be this geometrical, symmetrical thing. There's always going to be that human touch, and I think that's really interesting. So these were some of the very first camera rotations that I did before Thesis. I really focused on just taking photos of literal lights. I really experimented with Christmas lights and lamps and just all these different things. So when I started this Thesis project, I really wanted to figure out how to kind of capture more complicated lighting phenomena. These were some images that I took for Thesis pretty early on. I thought that I would probably just dive into camera rotations my entire Thesis process. So I really looked at the qualities of the materials and really tried to embrace them in this process. That image is made with some tulle fabric, and I love the way that the light catches it and kind of reflects off of it. And the one on the other one is a plastic guitar with some very metallic paint. So I discovered that I faced some limitations even with this process. I picked this process because it was so much, I saw it as so much more stable than camera tossing, but then when I really got into it, I found out that I kind of missed some of the chaos that camera tossing gave an image. So I started to really look at ways that I could kind of expand my practice and either develop new techniques or kind of take these existing techniques and transform them. So one of the things that I wanted to do for quite a while was figure out how to take light painting images during the day. So because you're working with a very long shutter speed, it's very easy to take a photo and it just turn out plain white during the day. To kind of problem solve this, I looked to see what other fields of photography did when facing this challenge. A field of photography that often also uses really long shutter speeds is landscape photography. So as you can see, the slow shutter speed in this image really makes these waves have a very painterly brushstroke effect. And I remember looking at some of these images and being like, it would be really cool if instead of the motion from these natural things, it was from a camera and part of this process. So that's how I kind of started with these images. Landscape photographers use a neutral density lens filter, which is a lens filter that goes over the camera and blocks out some of the light. So it allowed me to use much longer shutter speeds and still maintain the scene and the correct exposure. However, I did find that my process had to change a lot because even with a neutral density lens filter, I'm not going to be able to take 2 to 3 minute exposures during these really bright lighting situations. It was kind of really fun to rediscover that like passion and experimentation that I found freshman year in camera tossing and sophomore year in camera rotation by doing these images. I found myself studying how light worked at different times of day, in different lighting situations. This one is done on a very cloudy day, and the other one is done in very bright, sunny, midday light. So there's a lot of different lighting considerations and that kind of thing, which I became really fascinated with. I also started to look at other kind of fields of photography and also dive deeper into landscape photography and figure out techniques from those fields of photography that I could transfer over to light painting. This is a technique called a lens burst, and it's done by slowly zooming in or slowly zooming out while you're taking a photo. I found that a lot of landscape photographers use this while capturing cityscapes, but they still typically only do it for 2 to 3 seconds. That kind of led me to create images like these, where I took my camera processes and then applied kind of new processes on top of it. I also really wanted to push kind of camera bursting as far as it could go. Like I said, typically people do these for like 2 to 3 seconds, and I was doing them at night for more than 2 to 3 minutes, just kind of zooming in and zooming out at different speeds, seeing what kind of effects that I could get. Another technique that found its way into my photography, which isn't light painting at all, is refractography. Before starting this project, I had no clue about it, and it's a pretty similarly obscure technique to light painting. It's a lensless photography technique, so as you can see, you take the lens off of your camera and you replace it with an object that either reflects or refracts light. So that would be either glass or different plastics. I felt that glass really kind of gave them a more watery effect, while plastics typically made it a little bit more grainy and almost like kind of like a galaxy type feel, which I really enjoyed. I also started to look at my techniques and kind of think about how I could develop them myself. This is an original technique that I call camera gridding. I could take the same kind of equation and methods that I used on a table that spun and kind of applied them to different forms of motion. This is me kind of moving me kind of moving a camera around a grid. And it kind of does the same thing, only it creates a very different visual result from the camera rotations. As I was taking these, I found that the photos that I created during the daytime had a very different visual effect than the ones that I took during the nighttime. The ones during the daytime are very bright and they utilize more simple motion. This is because of limitations with the techniques themselves. And instead of trying to bend the process like I probably would have done when I was much younger into these processes, I wanted to listen to the limitations of the process and really figure out how I could still kind of make them mine, navigating these limitations. So as you can see, these do use a lot more simple motions, but I tried to really make them intentional. I found that taking a lot of botanical subjects was really interesting to me because of all of these lines that are created through them that I could really utilize in my camera motions. These are some of the ones during the nighttime. As you can see, they're definitely a lot more complex motions, and they contain a lot more layers. There's a lot more just innovation that you can do when you have a much longer time period to do that in. These kind of ideas of these two separate aesthetics really found their way into my installation and contributed to the choice to make two different distinct structures that utilize these different aesthetic responses and stimuli. So after I had taken a lot of images, it was kind of a question of how I was presenting them. I had printed a lot of my work in the past, and I was never really happy with it. I think to successfully print them, in my opinion, they would have to be really large scale, and I didn't really want to navigate making prints that large of a scale. And I also just didn't really think that it did the work justice. These images have so much motion and layers to them that creating them in these still sheets on a mat board just kind of felt impersonal. So I started to make animations such as these. I just started to apply really simple camera motions my camera was going through kind of back to the images and kind of reanimating them. I found this to be a really interesting project, one because I had never done animation, so it was a lot of kind of learning this new process, which was really exciting again. And also it gave me the opportunity to really think about like, how did I take this photo and how do I want to illustrate this process into my work? As these videos developed, I made 2 separate ones to keep with the different aesthetics. And I started to lay different videos on top of them of different lighting phenomena that maybe I thought would look really good in a light painting, but I couldn't take it for one reason or another. Either it was too short-lived of a phenomena, or like I was on a plane, something like that. But I could still take these videos, overlay them on the images, and kind of have these essences of these experiences still in my project, similar to kind of digital collages that I had done in the past. I also created sounds to go with the videos. This was definitely a collaborative process with fellow student Emma Moline. This collaboration definitely helped me grow in a lot of ways. First, it's a really interesting process to share this creative vision with somebody else and kind of have trust that they'll believe in it, and also that you'll have the teamwork to kind of balance these 2 very different ideas of what this may look like. There were many times that she was imagining something that I just couldn't imagine because I didn't have experiences with sound. And there were many times where I was looking at my photos and kind of being like, wouldn't it be cool if like a sound sounded like a line? She was like, I know nothing of what you're saying right now. Emma is definitely a very talented sound designer. She has a lot of experiences with theater. She said that working on this project, she viewed as kind of this alternative theater. It was this collaborative process, and because it's an installation, it's still really about getting a response from people, similar to theater. So I thought that was a really interesting connection that she made. These were some of the sounds that she made. I found that her process of taking these sounds that she experienced in everyday life were pretty similar to me taking these objects and photographing them in these distorted ways. That is my uncle whistling, and I remember taking this sound clip and being like, I don't know if this will sound cool, but I don't know, it was this really interesting thing with property. It had some really interesting like properties of sound. And after I described them to her, she kind of was like, oh, you're talking about this and this, all these technical sound components, and kind of could emphasize those in sound editing. This was another one that she made. I really love that sound effect for multiple reasons. I think my favorite reason is because those are microwave buttons. And I remember telling her this very obscure phrase like, what if like microwave buttons were more wobbly? And she came up with that really interesting kind of effect, and I really kind of fell in love with it. So after we kind of recorded all of these different sounds, we put them into these soundtracks to go along with the 2 different structures and the 2 different videos that are playing throughout them. Another component of this project was creating scents to go with these structures. So I've always kind of been interested in perfume and olfactory art. Before I came to college, I really was interested in going into cosmetic formulation. And I kind of realized through taking different classes that I really wasn't interested in a lot of the marketing components or a lot of the science that kind of goes into making a consumer product, but I was more interested in the experience of scent and the different perceptions that it can invoke in people and kind of the more emotional aspect of it. My olfactory art process uses a lot of techniques from perfumery. So I use perfumer's alcohol. It's a very thin alcohol that's formulated to disperse scent molecules really well, so it mixes in. If you were to use a regular alcohol, it may not get that seamless kind of experience of the scent. It's also very good at kind of blending the scents together. It doesn't have a very strong scent, and it kind of keeps a lot of fragrances more fresh than if you were to use a regular alcohol. I also used a mix of essential oils and fragrance oils. Essential oils are oils that are directly derived from distillation processes, while fragrance oils are oils that are made in a lab to mimic more complicated scent experiences that maybe you can't distill. When creating these two different structures, it was really interesting to kind of look at my images and look at the videos and think like what kind of sensory experiences I wanted to invoke, both with images and scent and sound. For scents, I really tried to emphasize scents that highlighted kind of full body experiences with fragrance. The one structure with more of the very simple motion of the light painting photos has more calming herbs in it and that kind of thing to kind of highlight the simplicity and calmingness of those images, while the other group of images I formulated a very fragrant, it has very floral and fruity notes. It also has something called sparkling aldehyde, which is a fragrance molecule that is designed to kind of mimic champagne popping in your nose. So I thought it was really interesting to take these physical experiences that you can get and weave them into this installation. Some really big influences for me for scent is first Gail Knowles. Gail Knowles is an interdisciplinary neurology scholar and artist, and she makes really interesting work using scent to kind of talk about human perception and relationships. One of her biggest projects was the World Sensorium. This was a scent that she spent decades researching. She did research looking into all of these different countries and kind of what was the most recognizable scent from them, and then she formulated them into one scent. I thought this idea was really interesting. Of course, this was a huge undertaking, and I can't compare my scents to it, but I did take all of these different kind of scent experiences from my daily life and compile them in a similar way than she did with this one, and I thought that was it was a really like big moment for me to read her kind of work and kind of relate it back to my own. Another artist that uses kind of an olfactory component to his work is Ernesto Neto. He creates these very large installations with this nylon fabric, and he puts these very fragrant herbs and different botanicals in them to create these kind of sagging things. I watched videos of people interacting with his work in a museum setting, and it really clicked for me that that was a similar experience to what I wanted people to experience with my work. A lot of people don't really know how to first react to his work, and then I've also found that some people, if they maybe weren't knowledgeable about his background, were surprised about kind of the fragrance component to his work, and I thought that was really interesting. And I also was really inspired by materials for him. When I wanted to kind of put a scent component into my work, I had this question of how this could be seamlessly incorporated. And him mixing fabric and these botanical herbs kind of gave me the idea that I could spray fabric with scent and it might maybe work. So that's what I did. I first tested it on this really thin fabric that I had selected because I thought that it would make the projections look really kind of seamless. And then I realized that the more thin a fabric is, the less density it has to hold scent. So it really kind of threw me for a loop at first because I had this fabric picked out and then I was like, this is not going to hold on to a scent at all. Then I really started to look at my materials and think about just what materials both accomplish letting light through and holding on to scents or moisture. It kind of led me down the path of researching agricultural fabrics. This fabric that I used was originally made to put over plants to protect them from insects. So it really did fulfill my two needs of letting light through and then also holding onto the scent and keeping it close to the fabric. This is the first structure that I made with more of the very like botanical and natural kind of light painting video. I really wanted to keep the structure simple because in my mind a lot of those video components are more simple in this one. I really was amazed afterwards at how the images looked from the inside with the new fabric I chose. Although they didn't create this very seamless, airy appearance, they got the texture kind of the material, and it was this other layer of manipulation that my images went through that I thought was really interesting. This is the second structure of my installation, which with much more of the light painting images that I took during nighttime that had a lot more vivid colors and complex motions. I wanted to kind of illustrate that again with the materials that I selected. Using just the plain materials didn't really work with this one. I felt that it kind of, instead of elevating it like it did the other one, it kind of sunk it down. So that's when I started to play with the idea of putting cellophane over it. Cellophane, I learned from my adventures with refractography. It kind of refracts and reflects light in this really interesting way. So I thought it would be really cool to put this on my structure and kind of make a reference back to those photography processes that I was utilizing. As you walk through the gallery tonight, I hope that you become immersed in the world of kinetic light painting as much as I've been in these 4 years. Thank you. Yeah.
Can you talk about how the process of what you choose to photograph funnels into like the finished piece a little bit more?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I really like about light painting is it takes these really ordinary objects and gives them an opportunity to be elevated. So when looking for materials to kind of work with the structure, I felt that it was very fitting that I went back to kind of these agricultural and industrial fabrics. Because although a lot of people look at them and they don't think twice about it, these qualities were really perfect for my project. I also find that it's really interesting to me to kind of look at different objects and kind of think like, hey, like, how would light interact with that? So I found myself again looking at fabrics and plastics and kind of playing with how the light from the projector would work for it, and it really kind of came full circle for me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Bill.
I would like to introduce the next speaker, Kylie Leaves.
I am Kylie Lears. I don't know if you guys may have not noticed, but I was a senior last year. I decided to come back this year to finish reviewing. This right here is called Apartment 2020. It is my apartment that I lived in through during 2020 and 2021. The apartment 2020, an unkept world hidden away from people, a scaled down model of my own home, closed, where the doors and the windows in some people's are the only viewpoints of where you can see through. I wanted to show I was overwhelmed with other priorities that I ignored the cleaning. I was embarrassed to even let my own family in, and I became frustrated and gave up on cleaning. Now, I always had a problem with keeping my space clean. I was never really bothered of how my room was kept until I moved out of my parents' room and started living on my own. I started this work at the end of 2020. I was in my kitchen looking at a pile of dirty dishes while trying to figure out how I'm going to do the laundry and wipe up all of the chili that had just rolled off the stove top. Now, instead of cleaning it, I decided to ignore it and started to study my apartment layout and then created mock-ups because I just didn't want to bother the mess. Now, since I was able to work from home, my apartment became my own studio. I had a cramped studio that was already cluttered. Soon later, I had piles of cardboard, scraps, and other art supplies that created a blockade for that space. I was already adding on to the crowded area. No matter what I did, the mess always came back. Now, I had to learn how to adapt to my surroundings, which made me really think about the materials I was using. Instead of going out and buying materials such as cardboard and the trash, I decided to pull some of my own trash out to create some of this work. When the materials came pretty quickly to me, I wanted something that was easy to access and affordable for the walls. Since cardboard likes to bend when you try to paint on it, I decided that I needed a sturdier wall. So I decided to use poster board. For my furniture piece, most of the kitchen, I got inspired from my father. He said that I could make anything from the trash can, and make art out of it. So I did that. I took out the cardboard and the wrinkly ad papers out of the recycling bin and began creating. I always use hot glue as an adhesive for the majority of my artwork, but I never really thought about using it as the material. So while I was creating the knobs for my dishwasher, I started to play with it and realized that I could use this to create the toilet and the bathtub to kind of show like the shininess. And then for the lighting, with this lighting, with the lighting in the piece, if the lighting in this piece correlates with the actual lighting of my home apartment. By leaving the light on, it highlights the disarray state of each room. And then for fabric, while I was searching for ideas for fabric, I came across Dollhouse work, The Military Closet. And in this, he used his own personal military uniforms, his picture of his, and a picture of his wife. And I kind of used, and then I got from that that I wanted to use my own clothing. So I decided to cut out pieces from my own clothing from that apartment. Yeah. I had an interest in miniature sculpture sculptures for the long time, for as long as I can remember. This is my first time experiencing the construction part, for example, the scaling down the building each pieces. But it wasn't for the painting portion. When I was younger, I was introduced to these tiny little figures by my father. They were between half an inch to maybe a little bit over a couple inches. My family and I call them minis, but they are used for fantasy style tabletop game called Dungeons and Dragons. Painting these figures involves sitting very close to your work and having steady hands and a lot of patience. I use from what I've learned from my father and my own experience and put it towards my smaller pieces such as the microwave and other kitchen appliances. I wanted the inside of the apartment to look lived in, and not just by the current residents, but by the previous ones. While I was researching ideas, I came across Alice Christine's installation called The Unchanging World. She created a 1/10 scale abandoned dollhouse. This piece focused on transitions from childhood to adulthood. I took notes of how the trim of the roof is expanded and how a gray tone, expanded and has a gray tone. The wedges of the wooden floors, the broken windows and the torn walls. I was intrigued by how the state of the dollhouse and how she put details to make the dollhouse look realistic as possible. I used Christine's piece as a guide for mine. My work isn't realistic, but it has enough details to represent a apartment that's been lived in for many years. I wanted to show how I felt about my living condition. I'll get to it, but never do. Feeling so overwhelmed that the climbers get annoyed and not having the time to think. I came across an installation artist, Pepon, years ago. He mainly focused on story-driven or memory installations, and he creates these scenes to focus on contradictions in which can coexist with beauty, anger, and use of different emotions. His viewers were forced to be surrounded by chaos and to talk about what he's presenting. I took a different approach. I created a small enclosed space where my viewers would have to get up and personal, so more like a creepy Tom type of deal, and look through the windows and through the door cracks to look inside. Now, looking back a year ago today, I didn't understand why I was so overwhelmed by how my apartment looked, or why I would see my family's clean homes and question myself, why can I not get my living room looking like theirs? If my husband decided to invite someone over, I would stop doing whatever I'm doing and frantically clean up the place, trying to make it seem like I had everything put together. Now, having a new perspective from becoming a mother, I was really afraid of being judged. I'm not sure what label I was worried about last year before I was a mom, but this year I looked back and I was really afraid of being labeled as that bad mom because I could not keep up with the cleaning. Through my experience and reading new moms' experience in the U.S., there is still this stigma of moms being responsible, doing more than just doing more of the cleaning, cooking, and taking care of the baby. Now, I am very lucky to have a husband that is really great with taking care of our child. But through my experience, I still feel that I am responsible to make sure that the house is clean, the dinner is made, and everything is put together. And sometimes I do get overwhelmed about everything, with everything that needs to happen. That cleaning is the last thing on my mind. And lastly, I want to thank Aaron Graham for helping me with the display and really helping me to give back here. I really want to thank Brian Ford and Ravon White for being here for me, especially for Ravon, because she's been letting me in the building quite a bit. So, yes, and thank you for sitting here and listening to my presentation. Yes.
You made this while you were living in this apartment, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to kind of, it seems like, nitpick every aspect of the environment that you were living in order to duplicate it?
Yes. So I pretty much took pictures of every single corner of each room that I lived in. And then I really focused on what was really bothering me. So for the kitchen, I really focused on any stains on the counter, the pile of dishes, and the laundry that is coming out of the laundry room. If that makes any sense.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. Yes.
So for a number of the rooms in this model, it's pretty easy to see when you have a large doorway. But for the living room space, in my experience, that doorway's covered in some, what I imagine are curtains. And then the peepholes. Do the peepholes come as a result of the room being hard to see into? Or are they like also an intentional way to create a little more vision while maintaining?
Yes. The people looking into the living room came with the people of the, because sometimes you can look through the boards a little disorientated. But the people looking into the dining room, that was the last source because I needed to be able to see through that. Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm going to piggyback off of his question. Can you explain why, like in the reference that you brought up of the dollhouse, there's essentially like one whole side of it that's cut off and like that's how everybody sees inside. Can you explain why you didn't do something like that where you had like purely structural elements that were holding it up where you could still see inside all the way around?
Yes. So, while I was experimenting with the living room, because the living room had like was living room and the dining room and the studio all put together, it was very difficult to be able to see without looking over it. So, while putting just another piece of poster board on top, I realized that I really wanted people to see inside through the windows and the doors. I don't know if you guys ever gone by a house and you notice the windows open and you take a quick peek of what the inside looks. That's really what I was intending for, because I do that a lot. So I'm just a very curious person.
Thank you.
Yes. Anything else? I would like to just ask Ravon Wright.
say thank you all for coming here this evening to listen to my peers and myself speak about our process, inspiration, and completion of our senior thesis. My piece, named My Self-Sense of Security, is to be read as one sentence but can actually be broken down into 3 separate subjects and topics. The first 2 words, myself, describes myself, my inspirations, and my mentality. The word sense speaks about the materials that I worked with, the reasons why I worked with them, and the importance of material choice to those with ASD, or autism spectrum disorder. And the last word, security. My artwork was constructed and intended to create a sense of security and safety for those who are neurodivergent like myself. Let's begin with what my piece is physically composed of. My piece is a large-scale tapestry made from medium-weight cotton muslin that has been hand-dyed from black at the top of the piece and fades into dark navy blue at the bottom. The underside of the piece has golden line work created entirely out of tri-folded bias tape made out of caution satin. The top side of the work has nothing extraordinary about it, but what can be seen are thousands of tiny sewing machine perforations made through the sewing process. The base of the piece is constructed out of 2 20-foot by 5-foot sections of muslin conjoined together to create a seam down the center. A circular aperture in the center of the fabric separates that center seam into 2 separate seams. The overall shape of the piece is what I have decided to call a quill tip shape. Its original boxy nature tapers into a blunt point, similar to the tip used for calligraphy pens in historical writing bills. This quill tip helps create a shape. This quill tip shape helps create a dynamic silhouette and draws attention to the way in which I have dyed the fabric. The curves of the quill tip are really where you can see the most visible change in color from black to blue, and creates a subtle transition in color. Now that you have a general idea of what my piece is and have seen a brief video of it installed, it's time to discuss who I am as the creator of this work, the technical process that went into its construction, and where the inspirations and influences lie. The first and most important thing you need to know about me, the creator, is that I have autism. I was diagnosed at a very young age with Asperger's and have gone through many years of speech and reading therapy to be able to function like the rest of my peers. But how I experience and how I define autism spectrum disorder are going to be different from how you define them. So I want to share the definition of ASD, autism spectrum disorder, and how it affects me in my daily life and how it affected my creations. So, what is ASD? ASD, described by, that is my bad. ASD, described by the American Psychiatric Association, is a complex developmental condition involving persistent challenges with social communication, restricted interests, and repetitive behavior. While autism is considered a lifelong disorder, the degree of impairment in functioning because of these challenges varies between individuals. I have what is deemed as high-functioning autism. Though it is an unofficial term, all it means is that I can govern everyday life without the interference with outside medical professionals, medication, or personal aid. But I am only this way because of my family and the many years of therapy that I've gone through to be who I am today. However, the therapy was not a cure-all solution. It still interferes with my basic communication and my creative process regularly. The lessons from my therapy sessions are still active lessons that I rely on and look back on to help govern myself from day to day. I have made great strides to become a proper and functioning adult despite the mental setbacks. However, being autistic can be incredibly helpful. Restricted interests and repetitive behaviors can be seen as something negative, but I would like to see it as an extra built-in feature into my brain. I have utilized this ingrained genetic behavior to develop good studio practice and define my career as a seamstress and an artist. Sewing is a very repetitive motion. Cut your material, pin it together, and sew. Those 3 monotonous motions make up well over 85% of my thesis. I have manipulated these repetitive tasks of sewing into something that I can understand and do as a career. This monotonous sewing process is something I have been doing for almost close to 2 decades, and I am not tired of it at all. It is the basis for my technical background and what has led me here today. My technical background as a seamstress and as a costumer began when I was about 6 years old, making this year my 17th year of sewing. It was a form of bonding between my grandmother and I, and it kind of helped create this sense of structure in my life. It was a form of bonding. And through this bonding, it created an endless supply of creation, setting my brain on fire with different ways that I can interpret sewing. It led to making shirts and skirts, purses and jewelry. There was never an end in sight to my creation, and so, because of that, I wanted to learn as much as I could about sewing. And thus, senior year of high school, I took a costume construction course. This course was a gateway course into what would be my career in sewing and lead to my future job here at Thesis College as the head of costumes and costume construction at the Scott Studio Theater, and eventually to what will be to what I will become as a freelance seamstress. My technical background gave me a fundamental understanding of materials and their behaviors, as well as the construction method necessary to complete my thesis. If I were to distill the entirety of my construction process of my thesis down to a singular word, it would be repetitive. And that's because it was. It took multiple dyeing sessions to get the black portion of my piece to be as dark as it was. 4 sessions exactly. The same process of boiling water, adding the dyeing solution, waiting hours for the dye to set, and then moving it to the washer and then the dryer. I did this entire process alone 4 times. And then came the making of all the gold detailing that you see underneath the piece. I marked out all of the lines that I would use as a guide to cut and cauterize the satin that would be used for the underside. Then ironing all the gold detailing down into manageable strips, where it was then turned into all the line work on my piece. All of this had to be done before I could even start the sewing process. As I stated before, these 2 materials make up a majority of my thesis, and that is, I phrased that wrong, I'm so sorry. As I stated before, the 2 materials that make up the entirety of my thesis are cotton muslin and satin. These 2 materials were deliberately picked for a reason. The texture of my materials was a huge decision that needed to be made for my project because I needed to be able to work with them without getting overstimulated. Overstimulation is something everyone can experience, whether it's auditory, visual, sensory, or social overstimulation. To the point, but specifically for autistic people, textures are a major reason for overstimulation to the point of complete avoidance and outright refusal to interact with certain textures. I myself have many textures I can't even touch today. An example my mother gave me was my outright refusal to reject or to wear corduroy as a child. People who grew up in the 90s know what all of the children's clothes were corduroy looked like. I couldn't handle this. It brought me to the point of outrage that I would scream, cry, throw things, and desperately try and get out of the outfit or even cause physical damage to my surroundings. The kitchen oven was often the victim of these fits. The only way to console me was to remove the material from my body and not allow me to wear it. Funny enough, this was my mother's first hint of me having ASD, because neither of my older siblings had displayed such behavior when they were my age. And so she took me to a child psychiatrist, and the rest is history. The materials of my piece were immensely important to me. Not only did I have to find materials that were accessible within my budget constraints, but I had to find materials that would not make me upset touching them over and over and over again for several months on end. And the 2 materials that I found that were easy to purchase were cotton muslin and costume satin. And despite their inexpensive nature, they actually make a nice harmonious pair when placed together. After the muslin had been treated through the dyeing bath, it had created this nice dimpled texture that faded really well into the smooth, soft, shiny texture of the satin. Aside from the materials, the source of inspiration and medium was another grand decision that I needed to find a verdict for. Like all of you, I consume different forms of media every day. Because of that media consumption, I'm constantly inspired by other artists and different medias. There are two forms of media that inspired my work for my thesis, and that was video games and architecture. I was introduced to the video game Bioshock as a very young kid. My older brother was the one who introduced it to me because he had a habit of playing video games in the living room of my childhood home. Bioshock was a game released in August of 2007 by the video game company 2K Games. The entire city of Rapture, the environment that the game takes place in, is built in the Art Deco style, and this decision was decided by the creative director, Ken Levine, after he traveled to the Rockefeller Center and saw the Atlas statue that stands before it. Because of this artistic decision and the talented artists, such as Jim Martin, this video game was my first introduction to the art style and movement of Art Deco. And from then on, it has become my favorite art movement of all time, and as you would expect, Art Deco architecture influenced my thesis. The best way to define Art Deco is the predominant decorative art style of the 1920s and 30s, characterized by precise and boldly delineated geometric shapes and strong colors. The architecture bit is my most important inspiration. One building and its creators are a massive inspiration to me, and that is the Boston Avenue United Methodist Church located in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And the artists Ada Matilda Robinson and Bruce Joel. The building itself has a bit of a tragic backstory. In 1921, the deadliest race riots known to this country had ever seen took place. According to an inflammatory story, Dick Rowland, a black teenager, allegedly assaulted Sarah Page, a white teenager, in a downtown Tulsa elevator. A vigilante mob backed by the Ku Klux Klan looted businesses and homes in the Evergreen area, ultimately burning most of the community to the ground. Hundreds of residents were either injured or killed, and thousands were displaced, their homes and businesses destroyed. Into this mix of sorrow stepped the pastors of the local church as they reached out to their members. It was apparent that more room was needed to accommodate for their ever-growing congregation. Two of the largest churches were built in the Art Deco style during the 1920s. True to its spirit of the times, one of the churches was caught up in a web of dispute over who should be recognized as the official designer. The Boston Avenue United Methodist Church sits on the south-southern edge of downtown Tulsa location, and was selected not only for its size of property, but also because of the three major congregations that take place in that area. The dispute over the position for official designer was between Ada Matilda Robinson, an art teacher at Tulsa Central High School, and her former student, Bruce Joel, a visionary architect who seamlessly integrated organic and geometric architectural elements. Ada Matilda Robinson was an art teacher teaching at Tulsa Center High School and was approached by her friend Audrey Cole, the wife of the chairperson of the building community for the church, to help design the building. Despite not being an architect, she was the person to design the initial sketch of the exterior image of the building and is responsible for much of the interior design and decoration of the church. The real architectural work fell to her former student, Bruce Joff. Bruce Joff, in his formative years, discovered Frank Lloyd Wright's work. He was drawn to Wright's philosophy of organic architecture and his emphasis on nature and individuality, and his intrigue by the prominent architectural buildings that Lloyd created. Central to his philosophy was the uniqueness of both client and building site as primary determinants of design and the use of natural elements alongside geometric elements. The significant achievement was designing and constructing the Boston Avenue Church as a collaborative effort with his former teacher. Through the efforts of these two amazing artists, they were able to create a building that welcomes thousands upon thousands of people every year. Through their efforts, they developed a safe space and sanctuary for all of the congregations and to anyone else who entered the building. And that is something I wanted to replicate with my own work. By using the elements of Art Deco and its beautiful geometric angular lines and strong colors, and the use of materials that did not overly stimulate both visually and physically, I have created a piece of work that I can thoroughly say brings me my own sense of security. Despite its original size and space, or despite its imposing size and space that it takes up, there is an innate sense of comfortability and security to my thesis. My self-sense of security is a piece that is meant to bring the feeling of safety through visual and sensory elements for myself and those who are like me. Thank you. Since I am the last one, I'm going to turn the lights on. Cindy?
Can you talk a little bit about the process of scaling your work up and down? Because I know you had made a series of models and kind of like practice.
So, what Cindy's talking about is for fall review, I made a significantly smaller model of this piece using just some plain Quilter's cotton and used my sewing machine to make zigzag lines that would mimic the gold piece. And that is a significantly increase in size from what you see today. I wanted to go big. It's my senior year and I was going to go out with a band whether I wanted to or not. But creating an actual size, like a ratio to go up, was a bit difficult because I had to also think of time constraints and all of the physical processes that would have to go into constructing this piece. So, does that kind of help?
Yes, thank you.
Anyone else?
Awesome, thank you so much. Thank you all so much for coming, and I just want to thank the group for a minute. Like, you all have worked so hard this year, and I really commend you for the tears, the effort, like everything you put in. I think it's really paid off, and it's been really great to watch you all do your thing tonight. I'm really proud of you, so thank you so much. Hopefully you all can come over to the gallery with us and check it out. And then I just want to also say the next group is going to be presenting May 6th, same place, same time, so please come and support them. Should be a really interesting set of lectures and a great exhibition as well. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you in the gallery.